When it began to fall apart, I was just 8 years old. Like any child that age, my parents were divorcing, and I didn't really understand what was occurring. All I knew was that things were changing quickly. One minute my family was together. The next I was being driven between two houses, each one a bit of what used to be my world. I was simply trying to sort it all out and find once more what normal would seem like. Then entered Kim. Not long after the divorce, my dad saw her, and initially, I thought she was really pleasant. She had come around, interacted with me as if she were really interested, and occasionally she would have brought me my preferred munchies. For some time, I considered her to be like those hip stepmothers you find on TV. I was terribly mistaken. My dad had married Kim within a year after the divorce, and suddenly she was here in our life constantly. It happened so fast that I hardly had time to get used to the thought of my parents not being together, let alone having someone else perform as she seemed in command. The changes were first minor. She would give me strange looks whenever I wanted to spend time with my dad, as though I were disrupting something. Little by little, it was like she was dragging my dad farther away from me. It was like a switch flipped the second they said, "I do." The friendly, almost kind woman I thought I knew faded away, and a different side of Kim emerged, one that made it abundantly evident I wasn't part of the family picture Kim envisioned. Nestled in his new life, my dad seemed to overlook, or perhaps showed no interest. When my dad agreed to take me, just the two of us, the first time I truly felt the ache of this new reality. For years I had been looking forward to it. It had been so long since we had done anything together. I was left behind, though. At the last minute, Kim had something planned that needed his attention. It was not the last occurrence. Every time I wanted to spend time with my dad, Kim somehow always had a reason, and my dad would always go with it, each and every time. Katie then arrived. Kim had a daughter, and although initially I had nothing against her, she was only a baby, it soon became clear that Katie's mother's first concern was Katie. Kim kept me close only when it would be most handy, using her as justification. Guess who was trapped watching? They wanted to go out, have a date night, or do something enjoyable. Promises of hanging out with friends or doing something exciting next time, only for last-minute arrangements to change, became a habit. I was left at home acting as their backup babysitter while they were gone, posing as a caring agent when they would say things like, "You're such a great big sister to Katie." But it was obvious I was just a handy assistant, nothing more. Seeing how they handled Katie hurt most of all. Their entire focus was on her every night they were at home. Kim would dismiss me with a smile that missed her eyes, saying, "This is just some mommy and Katie time," if I tried to join. It seemed as though she would always find a way to exclude me, and my dad would just sit there, silent, acting as though nothing was wrong. They visited a fair one day for Katie. For weeks I had been discussing the fair with my dad, suggesting my desired travel distance, but I discovered they had disappeared without me when I returned from the weekend spent with my grandmother. Like me, not meant to be part of the family, too. My dad claimed they thought it would be better as a family outing. Every time anything exciting seemed just around the corner, I would regard it the same. A visit to the beach? I would be allocated household tasks. Movie night? I would be packed off to see my grandmother. I loved spending time with her, so don't misunderstand me. Among the few people who gave me value and treated me like I cared was my grandma. But it was quite clear what was happening. My dad was simply letting it happen while Kim was ensuring I wasn't around. I quit even attempting to be included at one point. I would simply stay in my room, like a stranger in my own house. Bringing it up to my dad seemed unworkable. Once, thinking we could discuss it and hoping he would pay attention, I recall sitting him down. I told him I felt excluded, as if my only reason for being there was to watch Katie. All he did, though, was say, giving me this exhausted face, "Kim's doing her best, you know. She finds it difficult." I wanted to yell, shake him, and let him realize it had nothing to do with her. Not her, but I was the one being sidelined. He simply couldn't, nevertheless, see it. That day I saw nothing would change. I was merely a leftover piece that didn't quite fit. My dad had selected Kim in the family she imagined. I therefore quit trying. I stopped trying to be included and stopped requesting travel plans. I would just offer to be a babysitter, since what good was arguing for? Less I said, the more invisible I grew, and honestly, it felt better than the ongoing rejection. Looking back, one finds it difficult not to be resentful of those years. Too preoccupied in his new life to see what was happening to his daughter, I still wonder if my dad was blind or perhaps apathetic. Kim was okay with me not wanting to be there. That knowledge hurt, but the only way I could begin to organize my escape was to embrace it. I had discovered by the time I turned 10 not to get connected to any promises. Now my place in my dad's family was the extra set of hands, the invisible daughter, and the backup babysitter, and I quit wishing for anything more. A few years of attempting to fit into this so-called family, I at last quit deceiving myself. I was sure of my position. I was there to assist when needed and to clear the path when they did not require me. Though Kim would always try to say things like, "Katie needs some alone time with us, it's important for her development," the message was obvious. I was not a part of their picture-perfect world. My dad promised one day we would go out to celebrate my excellent marks. Planning everything in my brain, I became rather enthusiastic. Like it used to be, I was yearning some actual father-daughter time just the two of us could have. We had discussed visiting this neighboring theme park. I began to picture all the rides, the snacks, just like a young child seeing her dad once more. But I overheard Kim chatting to one of her pals a few days before our intended vacation. She was on the phone, endlessly discussing how she was organizing a special family day. At first I assumed she was referring to something else, but then she brought up the amusement park. I went still. She was planning a day out, and by the look of it, it didn't include me. "Just the three of us. I want it to be special for our little family," she said. I felt like I had been hit in the belly. The three of them? Little family we are. For a long, I stayed in my room trying to figure out how to bring it up to my dad without making it a big deal. Still, I missed the opportunity. Kim arrived in my room the next morning, sporting her customary false smile. "Your grandma needs a bit of help this weekend," she remarked, her voice laden with tenderness that never felt true. She was so phony, like she was doing me a favor, but I knew she just wanted me out of the house. "She has been inquiring about you." I nodded and packed my bags, walking over to see my grandmother as I wanted not to create a confrontation. My grandma is loved. Among the few persons who respects me as I value is her. Over the weekend, we baked, watched vintage movies, and simply spoke. But all I could focus on throughout that was how my dad, Kim, and Katie were having a great time at that theme park without me. When I returned home, it seemed as though they had simply had their time of life. My dad was showing Katie images of the day while she was sprinting about with this enormous plush animal she had won. Both of them were smiling. For a minute, I stood there feeling absolutely invisible. Kim saw me and said in a sweet tone, "Oh, we didn't want to disturb you. We felt it would be great for you to spend some quality time with your grandmother." The way she said it was so phony, as if she expected me to feel appreciative of their leaving. Just nodding along, my dad seemed to be saying everything was great. He never even asked how I felt about being left out, or whether I was good with it. It seemed as though my emotions had no bearing. That became the trend going forward. Whether it was a beach visit, a movie night, or even a dinner out, they would find a way to shift me off somewhere else anytime something exciting was about to happen. They would suggest, "Your grandma could use some company," sometimes, and "Why don't you go over to your friend's house?" Other times, the story was always the same. Kim would have an excuse ready, such as, "This is just mommy and Katie time," or "We planned this ages ago and it'd be hard to change it now," if I ever requested to join along. One weekend, they had a beach day booked. After hearing them discuss it earlier in the week, I waited expecting my dad would invite me. Still, he said nothing at all. Kim walked up to me the evening before, all smiles once more. "I know how much you enjoy hanging out with your grandmother," she remarked. "How about you staying with her over the weekend?" Though I already knew it would lead me nowhere, I wanted to protest. I visited my grandmother's place once again, and sure enough, when I returned, they had an entire CD of beach pictures to flaunt. As Katie discussed playing in the sand and dining by the boardwalk on ice cream, she was shining. Kim's continuous manipulation hurt the most. They made it sound like the most perfect day, and I had to sit there smiling and act as though it didn't affect me. She would say things like, "Your grandma loves having you around. It makes her so happy." Or, "It's important for Katie to have special events." She would spin it so it seemed like she was doing me a favor, thus sounding like I should be appreciative of being sent away. And my dad followed along, behaving as though nothing was amiss. Like it were the most logical thing in the world, he would nod and smile. I snapped at last one time. Their vacation to a water park, somewhere I had been pleading to visit for years, was scheduled. I waited, thinking they would ask whether I wanted to come, but I recognized the usual tale as soon as Kim started talking about family bonding. I told her I wanted to go to the water park with her. She tried to send me off to my grandma's again. I didn't want to leave. She dropped the phony smile in a moment and gave me this chilly, irritated glance. She responded, "Well, we only bought 3 tickets," as though it was my fault for not fitting into her plans. Looking to my dad, expecting he would intervene, he simply shrugged as though he had no idea what to do. I went crazy at that point. I told them how unfair it was, how they only included me when they needed someone to watch Katie, and consistently treated me like an outsider. I mentioned I was bored with being their handy babysitter, and left out. Kim merely seemed startled, as though she had no idea what I was talking about, saying how much my grandma liked having me around, and how they were only trying to make sure Katie got her quality family time. She started her regular lines. But I stopped acting as though I could not see through it, although my dad said nothing save the customary, "We'll talk about this later." We never did. Every time I tried to bring it up, he would dismiss it as not really important, like I was chatting to a wall. They had their ideal little family, and I recognized then that Kim would always find a way to push me out, and my dad wouldn't be standing up for me. I so gave up trying. I abandoned asking to be included and stopped fighting. I watched quietly if they wanted me to look after children. I packed my stuff and departed silently if they wanted me to visit my grandmother's house. Going along with it was simpler than arguing and feeling even more invisible. I saw they hardly seemed to notice as I distanced myself. They continued their lives, spending family dinners, little trips, and adventures with Katie. Pretending it didn't bother me, I would watch from the sidelines. But it did, more than I would have ever confessed. My birthday turned out to be the breaking line. Though I had not expected much, their scarcely acknowledged behavior nonetheless stung. Kim created a little dessert that seemed more like an afterthought. They only sung a little happy birthday. Though it was merely a trip to get ice cream, I reasoned perhaps my dad would have something scheduled, but he never even tried. They returned the following day, simply the 3 of us. Katie was hopping about displaying all the toys she had won at the arcade they had visited when they returned. Invisible as usual, I was seated in my chamber. That was the mental moment when I realized I was done. If they preferred me absent, then good. Getting through school, hanging out with pals, and working out my getaway would be top priorities. I had given up hope for my fit in their ideal little universe. I came to see for the first time that I would have to create a true family for myself if I wanted one. I was counting down the days until I could at last go when I turned 14. Knowing that didn't make things any simpler, I knew I didn't fit their world already. When I could, I visited my grandmother's, stayed in my room, or hung out with pals. Better still, the less I was around Kim and my dad. Trying to avoid the sting of being left out and disregarded in my own family, I kept myself occupied. One weekend, then, I was supposed to spend out with my buddies. For weeks, I was excited about one of those rare events when we had all managed to synchronize our calendars. We were going to catch a movie, visit the mall, maybe get some dinner later. Just typical child stuff I missed. A day when I would not feel like an outsider was much anticipated. I just gazed at her, feeling my blood boil. Kim came into my room the night before with that fake smile she always wore when she was ready to seek a favor. She said, "Hey, so your dad and I have plans tomorrow, and we really need you to watch Katie." I told her I had already scheduled activities, and that for weeks I had been excited about this day. She behaved all astonished, as if she knew nothing, but I knew she did. She was always right. She carried on as usual, sighing dramatically, and said, "Well, we don't have anyone else." I felt my wrath growing, but I kept my voice steady. You would want to aid your family. This is not about supporting family, I added. This is about you not wanting to find anyone else to babysit Katie. I could see her face drop the decent act. You have to start stepping up, she shot. That was it. Your family now is this. I told her straightforwardly that I was always left out of the fun and only pulled in when it was convenient. It didn't seem like family when I was only there to babysit or finish chores. I could not stand it anymore. She only stared at me, her harsh, hard face reflecting her belief that I was acting theatrically. We'll discuss this later with your dad, she added, as if I were the one stirring problems. That meant something, and I understood it would be another one of those sessions when they spun everything to make me feel as though I am the issue. Knowing my plans for the next day dead in the water, I exited the room. Indeed, my buddies were texting me wondering when I would be ready the next morning. Tell them I couldn't go, once again, and it felt like a kick in the belly. I created some justification for a family emergency since I wanted them to know I was once more trapped watching children. They seemed irritated, I could sense. Nobody else would be like this. Kim's last-minute requests had caused me to repeatedly miss scheduled events. It was getting to the point where I knew they would stop inviting me to hang out. I was losing the few things that gave me regular feeling. Kim wasted no time dragging me into the kitchen for another family talk when my dad arrived home later that day. My dad looked fatigued, like he already knew what was coming and didn't want to deal with it. Kim began her regular lecture on family responsibility and how each of us had to contribute. She made it sound as though I was some lazy, unappreciative young person who never cleaned the house, which would not have been quite accurate. Although I did more than my fair part, to them, it made no difference. My dad merely nodded along when she finished, saying, "You know she's right." I stared at him, feeling a mix of wrath and grief, and questioned, "When's the last time we did anything as a family? Every time anything exciting came up, I told him I was the one left out and I was tired of Katie being treated like a nanny." I felt like I was hammering my head against a brick. He mumbled something about how things were busy and how I should know that raising a family takes effort from everyone. It made no difference what I said. He would always lean toward Kim. That's when I saw it wasn't only Kim who was the issue. My dad was allowing her to treat me like an outsider, and he was the one acting as though everything was good. It dawned on me he was not going to change. Too preoccupied with his new life with Kim and Katie, he failed to even see how much he was losing me. It felt weirdly liberating, even if it sucked. I gave up on it. I abandoned asking to be included and stopped fighting. I silently took care of things if they needed me to watch children. I packed my stuff and left if they wanted me at my grandmother's. That was simpler and more in line than constantly wishing for things that would never come to pass. They appeared to notice less the more distance I kept between us. I watched from the sidelines, acting as though it didn't upset me as they continued their outings, family dinners, and short excursions with Katie. That did, however. It wounded more than I could have told myself. Next arrived my birthday. I had discovered by now not to expect much, but it still ached when people hardly noticed it. Kim produced a small cake that seemed more like an afterthought than anything significant. They only sung a little happy birthday. Though it was only the two of us getting ice cream, I reasoned perhaps my dad had something scheduled. No, though. He never even tried. They left once more the very following day. Just the three of us. Katie was dancing about displaying all the toys she had won at an arcade they had visited when they returned. I knew I was done trying when I was just sitting in my room acting not to care. I was done hoping for a spot in their universe, done trying to be part of their family. I turned then on school and my friends. I began to dream of a time when I would not have to feel like an alien in my own dad's life, a time without them. I would finish school, accumulate some money, and work out how I could survive on my own. At 16, I finally felt like I had a plan. It was obvious that if I wanted happiness, I would have to find it somewhere else, somewhere they could not take it from me. My move was almost about ready. It came time when I turned 16. I had been waiting, hoping maybe my dad would at last notice what was happening, but I was done wishing. I had waited too many years on the sidelines of their family. while Kim and Katie performed front stage. For a while, my mother had been asking if I wanted to live with her full time, but I had been postponing, perhaps out of some meager, stupid hope that my dad would step up. But I knew nothing would remain after years of being ignored and treated as a free babysitter. I accepted my mom's offer since my dad had made his decision, and it wasn't me. I figured out the best approach to tell my dad without it turning into a full-fledged fight in my brain. I planned everything. Though I was anxious, I was ready to go and at last stop acting like everything was fine. One of those rare times Kim wasn't around to meddle, I waited for a moment when it was just me and him. Though hands were shaking a little, I set him down at the kitchen table, knowing I had to do this. I told him I felt like I belonged no more, and I wanted to move in with my mother full time. I set it all out for him, the years of feeling left out, of only being called on when they needed me to watch Katie, of being invisible in my own house. I thought he would listen, actually listen for once, and grasp. He simply sat there, not looking back at me, staring at the table. Like that was going to make everything right, he gave me this weary look and remarked, "You know, Kim's been trying her best to make this work." When he eventually looked up, I couldn't believe it. That was all he had to say, following all I had just advised him. He seemed to have hardly heard me at all. I told him once more how unfair it was, how they always left me out of everything fun, and how I was only there when they needed something. I repeated myself. If I explained it all, if I made it as unambiguous as I could, he would at last understand. Instead, though, he groaned and remarked, "You're being too sensitive." I realized there was no hope left at that instant. Kim wants to include you, but you just do not see it. Whatever I said, he would always be leaning toward Kim. He could not even see what was happening there in front of him, buried in his new life with her and Katie. Though strangely enough, I also experienced a feeling of relief along with frustration and gloom. At least right now I felt nothing guilty about leaving. Given him every opportunity to grasp, I had tried everything, and yet he showed no interest. He hardly objected when I informed him I had previously discussed moving home with my mother. He nodded as though he already decided that, should I wish to travel, then sure I could do so. There was no battle or effort to persuade me to remain. He seemed almost to be indifferent, as if he was fine with just letting me leave. That evening, I packed my bags. Kim was not at home, which was actually a benefit. I wanted no false pity or her guilt-trip me into staying under control. Feeling a strange mix of emotions, I piled anything I owned, including my clothes, into bags and boxes. Part of me kept hoping my dad would visit my room to attempt to talk me out of it, to offer a loving comment. Still, he never did. I loaded everything into her car when my mom came to fetch me up. I returned indoors to bid farewell to my dad after I finished. Looking uncomfortable, he was standing in the hall, unsure of what to say. Though it felt half-hearted, like one of those courteous hugs you give a distant relative, he hugged me. "Please take care of yourself, okay?" It was brief and empty, and I didn't know what else to say when he said, "Yeah, you too." I just nodded. Though part of me was hoping he would at last understand what he was losing and ask me to remain, he did not. He simply stood there, letting me go silently. Kim had not returned by the time I left, and to be honest, I didn't give it any thought. I was done with her interpretation of family, got into my mom's car, and kept staring back at the house, caught in a weird mix of grief and wrath as we drove off. Though I had grown up there, it no longer seemed like home. It was only a structure, occupied by individuals unconcerned about my presence or absence. Moving home with my mother was a relief, like a weight had at last dropped off my shoulders. She only expected me to be me, and that felt fantastic. I had no need to pretend to be fine when I wasn't or walk on eggshells. I thought I could really breathe for the first time in years. I appreciated more than I could say when my mom let me settle in rather than pushing me to talk about everything straight away. We finally sat down, though, and I told her everything. How Kim had made me feel like an outsider, how my dad never stood up for me, and how worn out I was of being treated like an extra. She was enraged, not directed at me, but at my dad. That he let this happen and that he let me feel this way in my own house infuriated her. And that helped me to feel as though my emotions were legitimate, rather than insane. She made it plain that I was welcome there, free from strings attached for as long as I needed. That was quite different from the way things had been at my dad's. I felt not guilty and not like I had to prove myself to fit. It was just ordinary, and I came to see how much I had missed. I kept waiting for my dad for the first 2 weeks, perhaps a call or a text, something. I reasoned perhaps he would get in touch, ask me to come back, or at least follow up to see how I was doing. Still, the phone remained muted. Not a call, not a message, nothing at all. Although I suppose I should not have been shocked, it still stung. Though part of me had thought that maybe my departure would be the wake-up call he required, it was not. Like I had never even been there in the first place. Though it hurt to admit, I knew I had made the correct decision. I could not keep waiting for my dad to be the parent I so sorely needed. I deserved to be somewhere I really felt wanted. I had life to live. Moving in with my mother was about finding a location where I wouldn't have to prove my place in the family, not only about fleeing my dad and Kim. At first, changing to a new routine felt unusual, but it was a nice sort of unusual. I spent more time with friends, concentrated on school, and even worked part-time to save some money and keep myself active. I was creating a life that belonged to me, one free from continual surveillance over my shoulder, wondering whether I would be left out once more. Everything seemed to be at last coming into place. Living with my mother fit a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. I was living my life, surrounded by people who really wanted me around, not merely floating through someone else's conception of family. It was at last the weight of always feeling like an outsider gone, and I was free to stop continuously bracing myself for letdown. I sensed for the first time a true home. We had dinner at this modest restaurant downtown a few months after moving in with my mother. This was one of those laid-back, friendly evenings when everything seemed fine. We came upon Charlie, someone I hadn't seen in years, while there. Charlie was the son of some old friends of Dad's, and we had spent a lot of time together growing up. Even while I was suffering with everything at his dad's, he had always been nice, the type of buddy who never questioned me or made me feel different back then. He had moved away a few years ago, but he was back now in town for college. We got to catching up on each other's lives, and eventually he inquired why he hadn't seen me around my dad's house in so long. Though I was first confused about how much I wanted to tell, finally I told him the truth. I told him I'd moved in with my mom full-time, that things had been difficult with Kim, and that it would be better for me to be with my mom. Charlie seemed really startled. He informed me that Kim and my dad had been telling others a different narrative, that my mom had somehow bought full custody by manipulating the courts, casting her as this monster who had made me flee. They said I had been taken away against my will. My mother was the brains behind it all. Hearing it, I sensed my blood heating. It was such a common action, fabricating the facts to fit their victim image. Right then and there, I made the decision not to allow them to disseminate that tale. I told Charlie what had really happened, how I had decided to quit feeling like I didn't belong and weary of being used as a free babysitter. I didn't hold back, telling Kim straight out I wasn't part of their family and how many times they had left me off vacations. Charlie simply listened. His countenance moved from shock to comprehension. "I had no idea," he said when I was done. Hearing it made me realize how brilliant your dad and Kim were at presenting a show. I always felt they were simply doing their best. While they behaved like the ideal family among others, behind closed doors the situation was quite different. A few days later, I began receiving texts from some of my dad's former friends, people I knew from my early years. From Charlie, who had allegedly told his parents, they had learned the truth, and soon, word got out among their friend group. While some of them wanted to apologize for not seeing what was happening sooner, others dropped in to find out how I was doing. The tale soon found its way to my dad and Kim's social circle, and let's say they weren't happy about it. I answered a call one day from a number I did not know. Usually I avoid such calls, but something advised me to answer. Kim called it. I'd blocked her previous number, so she must have acquired a new one. She began with a sugary tone, acting all concerned, saying she missed me and was thus really anxious. She cut right to the point, though, not too slow. "We have to discuss these rumors you have been disseminating," she added, her voice losing its charm. I nearly chuckled, as they are making life somewhat difficult for us. There are rumors. These were the truth. They were not gossip. Not spreading any rumors, I told her as much. She continued on about how I was making things more difficult for Katie and how their friends were treating her now. I simply informed everyone what happened, saying, "You're a good daughter, and we know you'll do the right thing for your family." She sought to guilt-trip me. I had heard all before. Like I hadn't been excluded from that word for years. She said, "Family." Now I was suddenly family once more when their reputation was on the line. "You and Dad made your decisions," I told her straightforwardly. She didn't take that well. "You cannot expect me to mend things when you did not even include me in your life." Saying Katie was really upset and not understanding why her pals were ignoring her, she sought to turn things around. She advised me to consider Katie as though it were my duty to tidy their mess. But I had finished with that. I told her, "Katie's not inside my purview." She kept fighting, but you and Dad decided to treat me like I didn't belong, so don't expect me to step up now. I had said exactly what I needed to. A number of my relatives then got in touch, suggesting I should help the family, and that Katie was only a young child who didn't deserve this. They stacked on, seeking to make me feel guilty for at last defending myself. But where were they all those years I was crying in my chamber, feeling like an alien in my own family? Back then, they showed no concern. Why should I care now? I still get a bit guilty for Katie occasionally. She is young, and none of this is her fault. She is not my child, though, nor my liability. Just because it would be handy for them right now does not allow me to let them control me into solving their difficulties. They made decisions and had to live with the consequences. Right now, I'm just paying attention to my own life. Kim and my dad can handle the results of their behavior. To me, they blew their opportunity to be a real family. I will not waste any more time attempting to rebuild a connection they shattered. Looking back, leaving turned out to be the wisest choice I ever made. Things at last felt normal once I moved in with my mother. I could breathe without thinking of myself strolling on eggshells. I was more than simply an extra, a babysitter, or a side consideration. I was just me. Over time, I created a life of mine where I could stop wondering whether I would be left out. I worked my part-time job, concentrated on school, and reconnected with friends in a manner I hadn't been able to previously. At last, I was living according to my own rules, not at the will of someone else. I am not sorry about leaving. The best decision I could have taken for myself was this one. Although Kim and my dad could have their own version of events, I know the reality, and I'm done trying to get them on my side or change their perspective. I followed my obligation, and it has helped me to be better off. I grew up in my dad's house, but long ago, it ceased to be my house. For me right now, home is anywhere I want to be, and I had to look for that as well.